Michelle Williams was no stranger to adversity. As a high-ranking officer in the military, she had faced challenges that would break most people, but each time she stood taller. Today, however, was different. Michelle was on a civilian flight, headed back home after a long assignment abroad. She had worked hard, and she deserved this break. The airport was bustling as she made her way to the check-in counter, her military uniform sharp, the golden insignia on her sleeves gleaming in the bright terminal lights. She felt proud, but there was something else today, a feeling of calmness. After all, she had earned her place. When she approached the gate, the flight attendants greeted her with smiles, and the usual small talk followed. But as she walked toward the first-class cabin, something unexpected happened. A man, who appeared to be in his mid-40s, stood up and blocked her path. His posture was rigid, and he looked at her with a dismissive air. Michelle, always professional, politely told him she was assigned to the first-class seat. "Sorry, miss, but that seat is mine," the man said with a smirk, his voice dripping with entitlement. He was wearing a suit, and from the way he carried himself, Michelle could tell he was used to getting his way. Michelle, though taken aback, did not show any frustration. "I believe there has been a mistake," she said, her tone steady but firm. "I have a first-class ticket." The man scoffed, glancing over her uniform. "Well, that's great and all, but I don't think someone like you belongs in first class," he said, his words cutting through the air. Michelle felt a flicker of anger rise inside her, but she quickly composed herself. She had dealt with people like him before. She didn't need to engage in a back and forth with someone who thought their wealth or status made them more important than others. She pressed the button on the call button, signaling for a flight attendant. When the attendant arrived, Michelle calmly explained the situation, holding up her ticket for verification. The attendant, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at the man, and then back at Michelle. "Ma'am, I apologize for the confusion," the attendant said. "Your seat is indeed first class." The man looked embarrassed, but instead of apologizing, he dug his heels in further. "I'm not moving," he said stubbornly, his voice louder now. "Why should I give up my seat for someone like her? I have more rights than she does." Michelle felt the heat of his words, but she refused to let them get under her skin. She'd faced far worse in her career. She knew how to stay calm and professional. The situation had escalated, but she knew she needed to stand her ground. "I'm sorry, sir, but that seat is rightfully mine," Michelle said, her voice steady. "I'm a soldier, and I serve this country. Respect is not given based on who you are or how much money you have. It's earned, and right now, you're not showing me any." The flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances, but Michelle stood her ground, not allowing herself to be intimidated. The other passengers began to notice the exchange, some staring curiously, while others whispered amongst themselves. Michelle wasn't bothered by the attention. She knew what she had to do. Just as the confrontation was reaching its peak, the flight captain, a tall man in his early 50s, walked up from the cockpit. He had been alerted to the situation, and now stood beside the flight attendants, his eyes scanning the tense moment. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm and commanding. Michelle looked at him and explained the situation briefly. The captain looked at the man in the seat, then at Michelle. He raised an eyebrow, clearly recognizing the seriousness of the situation. "Sir, if you could kindly vacate the seat," the captain said firmly. "This passenger has the correct ticket, and you are holding up the boarding process." The man's face flushed red as he reluctantly stood up, muttering under his breath. Michelle could see the shift in his attitude, the realization that his words had no power here. As he moved aside, Michelle took her seat in the first-class cabin. She sat back and sighed, her mind racing. She had stood her ground, but this was far from over. She could feel eyes on her, but she kept her focus on the seat in front of her. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about respect. Michelle had earned her place, not just on this flight, but in every room she entered. And if she had to remind people of that every once in a while, so be it. But as the plane took off, Michelle knew that this encounter wasn't just about a seat. It was a moment of standing up for what was right, no matter who you were. As Michelle settled into her seat, she couldn't help but feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. She adjusted her military uniform, making sure it was neat and professional. The flight was just beginning to taxi, and everything seemed calm again. But Michelle knew this moment wasn't over. What had just happened wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about the prejudices people still held, and she couldn't help but think about how common it was for people to assume things about others based on their appearance. The man who had refused to give up her seat, though now seated in coach, was still glancing over at her occasionally. His earlier smugness had turned into discomfort. Michelle was no stranger to that kind of reaction. She'd seen it many times in her life, but there was one thing that made this situation different. The captain, who had just helped resolve the issue, passed by again as the flight took off. He smiled at Michelle and gave her a respectful nod. He'd obviously been in many situations like this before, handling issues with grace and professionalism. But just as Michelle was beginning to settle into the flight, a small voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am." Michelle turned to see a woman sitting across the aisle from her, who had been watching the whole scene. She appeared to be in her late 30s, dressed in a well-tailored business suit. Her expression was both curious and respectful. "Yes," Michelle replied, her voice calm but attentive. "I couldn't help but overhear the conversation earlier," the woman said. "I just wanted to say, I think you handled that really well. Most people would have lost their cool, but you stayed so composed." Michelle smiled politely. "Thank you. It wasn't easy, but I've had my share of challenges. Sometimes you just have to keep calm and stay focused." The woman nodded, clearly impressed. "I completely agree, and it's people like you that inspire others, you know." Michelle wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially from strangers, but she appreciated the sentiment. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. And that, to her, was what mattered the most. Before Michelle could respond further, the woman smiled and introduced herself as Rachel, a business consultant who worked with high-level executives. Rachel explained that she had been observing Michelle throughout the interaction with the man and was genuinely moved by her composure. As they spoke, Michelle learned that Rachel had faced her own set of challenges in her career, working in a field dominated by men. She understood the kind of prejudice Michelle had just experienced, albeit in a different context. They found common ground in their stories, both women realizing how much they had in common despite their different backgrounds. Just as their conversation was flowing naturally, the flight attendants came by to offer drinks. Michelle, always polite but focused on her own thoughts, ordered water while Rachel chose something more elaborate. It was clear that Rachel was in a position of power in her professional life. She had the confidence that Michelle admired, but there was also a warmth to her character that Michelle found refreshing. After a few minutes, as the flight reached cruising altitude, the captain came over the intercom to make the usual announcements. But this time, there was something different in his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, "I'd like to take a moment to thank one of our passengers for their exceptional service to this country. Sergeant Michelle Williams has been a dedicated member of the military, and we are grateful for her service. We'd like to extend our appreciation to her for all that she does for us." The announcement was brief, but Michelle felt the warmth of the gesture. It wasn't about the attention. It was about the respect. The cabin filled with a momentary applause from several passengers, some of whom had witnessed the earlier exchange. Michelle couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Rachel turned to her, eyes wide. "Wow, that was unexpected. But I can see why now. You really are an inspiration." Michelle smiled again, though it was mixed with a sense of humility. "I didn't do it for recognition, but it feels good to know that people see what's right." Michelle's thoughts wandered back to the man who had initially taken her seat. She wondered if he'd learned anything from the experience. The flight was peaceful now, But she couldn't shake the feeling that moments like this were still important. They had a ripple effect. As she looked out the window at the passing clouds, Michelle felt a deep sense of gratitude. She wasn't just fighting for her place in the world. She was fighting for the next generation, the ones who would face challenges she couldn't even imagine. And today, she had stood tall, not just for herself, but for all of them. As the plane continued its smooth journey through the skies, Michelle sat back in her seat, reflecting on the encounter she'd just had. She was used to standing her ground when it came to matters of respect, but today felt different. It wasn't just about the man refusing to give up the seat. It was about something larger. The subtle prejudice that often went unnoticed, even in everyday situations. Michelle knew that standing up for herself was something she did without thinking. It had been a skill honed over years of military service, where she'd been trained to keep calm under pressure, to think clearly and respond decisively. But she couldn't help but wonder how many people had been in similar situations and hadn't felt able to speak up. It was moments like this that made Michelle realize just how important it was to stand firm, not just for herself, but for everyone who might not have the confidence to do so. As the flight wore on, Rachel continued to engage with Michelle. They chatted about everything from their personal lives to the challenges they had each faced. Rachel shared stories of working in corporate spaces that were often dismissive of her abilities, while Michelle talked about the many missions she had been on, the friends she'd lost, and the long stretches of time she spent away from home. They both agreed that, despite the struggles they had faced, they were stronger for it. But just as Michelle began to feel at ease, something unexpected happened. A young flight attendant approached her. She was holding a small note, looking a little nervous. "Excuse me, Sergeant Williams," the attendant said softly. "I've been asked to bring you this." Michelle took the note and looked at the attendant, who quickly walked away, leaving her to read the message in privacy. It was a handwritten note, neatly written in black ink. "Dear Sergeant Williams, I sincerely apologize for my earlier behavior. I acted thoughtlessly and made assumptions based on my own biases. You deserved that seat, and I regret my actions. I hope this apology can serve as a small step toward making things right. Sincerely, the passenger in seat 5A." Michelle was momentarily stunned. She had expected nothing from the man who had taken her seat. In fact, she hadn't thought much about him after she'd been allowed to take her rightful place. But here he was, admitting his wrongdoings in a way that was rare and unexpected. It wasn't every day that someone took responsibility for their actions, especially when it came to situations like these. Rachel, who had been watching Michelle closely, noticed her expression and raised an eyebrow. "Is everything okay?" Michelle nodded slowly, still holding the note. "The man who gave me trouble earlier, he just apologized," she explained. Rachel seemed surprised, her eyes widening. "Really? That's impressive. You don't see many people admit when they've been wrong." Michelle thought about it for a moment. "Yeah, I didn't expect it, but I appreciate it. It takes courage to admit you've made a mistake, especially when it involves something as personal as prejudice." The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, but Michelle couldn't shake the impact of the apology. She thought back to her early days in the military, when she was one of the few women and people of color in her unit. She'd faced prejudice then, too, but over time, she had learned how to navigate those situations, turning negative energy into a source of strength. But this was different. This wasn't a soldier or a colleague. It was a stranger who had acted thoughtlessly, and yet he had taken the time to make it right. As the plane began its descent toward their destination, Michelle realized how much this small act had meant to her. It wasn't about the apology itself, but about the willingness to change. In a world where mistakes were often ignored or justified, this man had taken a step to show that change was possible, no matter how big or small. When the plane finally landed, the captain came over the intercom to make a brief announcement, thanking everyone for a smooth flight. The passengers began to gather their belongings and make their way off the plane, but Michelle remained seated for a moment, deep in thought. Rachel turned to her one last time before getting up to leave. "You know, you've got an impressive way about you. I can't help but admire how you handled everything today." Michelle smiled, feeling a sense of peace that she hadn't expected. "Thank you, Rachel. It's not about impressing anyone. It's just about doing what's right." With that, Michelle stood up and made her way toward the door, ready to step off the plane and into the next chapter of her journey. She knew that, no matter what happened next, she had made an impact today, not just for herself, but for anyone who might need to find their voice in the face of adversity. As Michelle stepped off the plane and walked through the terminal, she felt a sense of satisfaction. The flight had been long, but the unexpected encounter with the man in first class had made her think deeply about many things. She had always known that prejudice was real, but this situation had given her a first-hand glimpse of how it could impact people's actions, whether they realized it or not. As she walked through the busy airport, Michelle's mind continued to replay the events from earlier. The man's apology had been unexpected, and it made her feel a sense of justice. Not everyone was willing to admit when they had done something wrong, especially when their actions came from a place of bias. But he had, and for that, she respected him. It had been an eye-opening moment for both of them. She couldn't help but think about how many people in her life had faced similar experiences. Throughout her career in the military, Michelle had seen countless examples of people who had to fight for their place, whether in the workplace or in society. Sometimes those battles were external, but often the hardest battles were the internal ones, the ones that came from within, from overcoming self-doubt or fear of judgment. In many ways, Michelle had learned to navigate those struggles with grace and patience, but it wasn't always easy. She had spent years proving herself, constantly having to work harder and be better than others to get the recognition she deserved. She was proud of her accomplishments, but she couldn't ignore the reality of what it had taken to get to where she was. As she made her way to the baggage claim area, she overheard a conversation between two women standing nearby. They were talking about the flight, discussing the incident in first class. One of them mentioned how impressive it was that Michelle had handled the situation so calmly. The other woman agreed, saying that it was rare to see someone stand up for themselves without getting angry or confrontational. Michelle couldn't help but smile to herself. It felt good to know that people had noticed her composure, but she didn't want the attention. It wasn't about being admired. It was about doing what was right. She had learned long ago that true strength wasn't measured by how loudly you could shout, but by how firmly you could stand your ground without losing your sense of dignity. As she waited for her bag, Michelle received a text message from her best friend, Karen. It was a simple message, asking how the flight had gone. Michelle smiled and quickly typed a reply, sharing the details of the incident and the unexpected apology. Karen's response was immediate. "Wow, that's crazy. I'm so proud of you, Michelle. You handled that like a pro." Michelle chuckled at the message, feeling a warm sense of support from her friend. But as she put her phone back in her pocket, she realized that the impact of what had happened wasn't just about how she handled the situation. It was about the change that had occurred. She had stood up for herself, yes, but she had also shown the people around her that respect wasn't something to be given based on appearances or assumptions. It was something that had to be earned, and it didn't matter who you were. As Michelle walked out of the airport and into the warm sunlight, she realized that her journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more situations where she would have to stand her ground. But she also knew that the lessons she had learned along the way had prepared her for whatever came next. And in that moment, Michelle felt a sense of peace. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She was enough just as she was. And as she moved forward, she would continue to stand tall, knowing that every small victory, whether big or small, was a step toward a better future for everyone. She got into her car and drove away, ready to face whatever came next with the same strength and grace that had carried her through so many challenges before. The world might not always be fair, but Michelle had learned that the only thing that truly mattered was how she chose to respond. And today, she had responded with dignity. That was a victory in itself. As Michelle drove home from the airport, her mind continued to replay the events of the flight. It wasn't just about the apology from the man in first class, although that had been a significant moment. It was about something deeper. She thought about the assumptions people made based on appearance and how often those assumptions could lead to misunderstandings. It was something she had encountered throughout her life, but today it felt different. Michelle had spent years in the military, proving herself day after day. She had faced challenges that many could never imagine, and with each hurdle, she grew stronger. But even with all the accomplishments under her belt, Michelle knew that some people would always see her for the color of her skin rather than the person she was. She had made peace with that fact, but today's encounter had made her reflect on the power of a single moment, how one action, one apology, could create a ripple of change. As she drove, Michelle's thoughts turned to her daughter, Maya. She thought about how she wanted Maya to grow up in a world where people were treated equally, regardless of their skin color. Maya was only 10 years old, but Michelle had already seen the spark in her daughter's eyes, the same spark that had driven Michelle to become the person she was today. Maya was strong, kind, and courageous in her own way, and Michelle knew that one day her daughter would face her own challenges, just as Michelle had. But the thought of her daughter also brought a sense of worry. Michelle knew that even though she had made strides in her own life, there was still so much work to be done. There would always be people who looked down on others for reasons that didn't matter. There would always be battles to fight, whether they were big or small. But Michelle also knew that she couldn't change the world all at once. It had to start with one person, one action, one conversation at a time. When Michelle arrived home, she was greeted by the familiar comfort of her house. The smell of dinner filled the air, and she could hear the soft hum of her husband's voice as he spoke to Maya in the other room. It was a reminder that despite the struggles she faced in the outside world, she always had her family to support her. As she walked into the kitchen, Maya ran up to her, wrapping her arms around her mother. "Mom, how was your trip? Did everything go okay?" Michelle smiled, returning the hug. "It was good, sweetheart. There was an interesting moment on the plane, but everything turned out fine." Maya's curiosity sparked, and she eagerly asked, "What happened? What was the moment?" Michelle sat down at the kitchen table, her daughter joining her. As she recounted the story of the flight, Michelle found herself reflecting on the importance of the conversation she was having with her daughter. Maya needed to understand that it wasn't just about the wrongs that were done. It was about how they were addressed. It was about teaching others to do better, to be better. "Maya," Michelle said softly, "you might face moments where people judge you by the way you look, just like I have. But always remember that you are powerful. Your heart, your mind, and your actions are what truly define you." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "I know, Mom. I want to be just like you." Michelle's heart swelled with pride. "I'm proud of you, Maya, and I'll always be here to guide you, just as I have been." Later that evening, after dinner, Michelle took a moment for herself. She sat in the quiet of the living room, reflecting on the lessons she had learned over the years. It wasn't always easy to keep going, but each day she grew stronger, more determined to live her life with purpose. She had learned that sometimes the best way to create change was simply by being true to who you are and standing up for what you believe in. As she looked out the window at the stars, Michelle felt a sense of calm wash over her. She knew that there would be more moments of challenge in the future, but she also knew that she was prepared. With the support of her family and the lessons she had learned along the way, Michelle was ready for whatever came next. She didn't need recognition or accolades. What mattered most was the impact she had on others and the example she set for her daughter. And as long as she continued to do that, she would remain proud of the woman she had become. With a deep breath, Michelle stood up, ready to embrace the next chapter of her life. There was work to be done, but she was more than ready to face it head-on. She had already proven that one person could make a difference. Now it was time to show Maya and the world what true strength really meant. The next morning, Michelle woke up early, as usual. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden light through the windows of her home. She made a cup of coffee and sat by the window, reflecting on everything that had happened. The flight incident still lingered in her mind, but now it felt more like a chapter of her life rather than a singular moment. It had been a small but significant experience, one that reminded her of the power she had as an individual. As Michelle thought about the events of the day before, she couldn't help but realize how important it was to stand up for what was right, even when others might not understand. The man in first class had apologized, and though it wasn't something she had expected, she knew that it showed growth on his part. He had taken responsibility for his actions, something that many people fail to do. That act of courage had given Michelle a sense of peace, knowing that change, even if it was slow, could still happen. But it wasn't just the apology that made her proud. It was the way she had handled the situation. She had stood her ground without raising her voice or losing her cool. In the military, Michelle had been trained to respond under pressure, to keep her focus, and to act with integrity. Yesterday's incident had been a reminder of how much she had learned and how far she had come. She hadn't needed to shout or argue to get what she deserved. Instead, she had calmly asserted herself, and that made all the difference. While Michelle enjoyed the quiet of the morning, her mind wandered back to the thought of her daughter, Maya. She had been so proud of her little girl's curiosity and strength. Maya had always been a bright, compassionate child, and Michelle knew that she was the one who would carry the torch forward, continuing the fight for fairness and equality. Michelle wanted Maya to see her as a role model, not just in how she dealt with prejudice, but in how she lived her life. She wanted her daughter to understand that true strength wasn't about power or force. It was about standing firm in your values, even when the world around you tries to tear them down. Later that day, Michelle went to her local community center to volunteer. She had always enjoyed giving back to her community, whether it was helping out with local events or organizing educational programs. The community center was a place where people of all backgrounds could come together, and it was there that Michelle felt like she could make the most impact. She spent the afternoon talking to young people about the importance of self-worth, respect, and understanding others. Her conversations were filled with encouragement, urging everyone to keep pushing forward despite the challenges they faced. As Michelle talked to the kids and listened to their stories, she realized just how much she had grown over the years. When she was their age, she had been filled with doubts and insecurities, unsure of her place in the world. But now, after years of experience and self-reflection, she knew who she was and what she stood for. She had fought for everything she had, and now she was in a position to help others do the same. Later in the evening, as Michelle sat down for dinner with her family, she couldn't help but smile. Maya had been telling her about the day at school, sharing little anecdotes about her classmates and teachers. There was a light in her daughter's eyes as she spoke, and Michelle knew that no matter what the future held, Maya would be just fine. She would continue to grow, to learn, and to push against the barriers that tried to hold her back. "Mom, when I grow up, I want to be like you," Maya said, looking up at her mother with wide eyes. "I want to help people, too." Michelle felt a warmth fill her heart. "You will, sweetheart. You already do. You don't have to wait until you're grown up to make a difference. You're doing it every day, just by being you." As they finished their meal, Michelle realized that the true meaning of her journey wasn't just about standing up to others. It was about empowering those around her, especially her daughter. The more she gave, the more she received in return. It wasn't about being perfect or never facing challenges. It was about resilience, kindness, and knowing when to stand strong, and when to extend a hand of understanding. And as the day ended, Michelle felt ready for whatever came next. Life wasn't always easy, but she had learned that standing tall and staying true to herself was the key to facing anything with courage. No matter how difficult the road ahead seemed, she knew she was not alone, and she would always have the strength to keep moving forward. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Michelle. The incident on the plane continued to be a point of reflection for her, but it also fueled her desire to help others in new ways. As she navigated through her daily routines, she noticed that the world around her hadn't changed as dramatically as she hoped. But one thing was clear: she had changed. The experience had empowered her to speak up more, to act with more purpose, and to help others feel empowered too. One afternoon, as Michelle prepared for her next community service project, she received a call from her superior officer. It was a routine check-in, but as they spoke, the tone shifted. Her officer explained that there had been an upcoming leadership conference where military personnel from various branches would come together. He suggested that Michelle attend and be a speaker, sharing her experiences about leadership and equality in the workplace. At first, Michelle was hesitant. She didn't feel like she was ready for such a big role. But then, she thought about everything she had been through and how much her perspective had shifted in recent months. She had spent her life leading with strength, but now she realized that her story wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had struggled against the odds, who had fought for what they deserved, and who had risen above challenges. She couldn't keep that to herself anymore. As Michelle stood in front of the mirror later that evening, preparing for the conference, she thought about Maya. She thought about the way her daughter looked up to her and the impact she was making on her. Michelle knew that what she did in that moment would not only shape her future, but also set an example for the next generation. Her words, her actions would echo in the lives of others, and she wanted them to be ones that inspired change. The day of the conference, Michelle felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She walked into the large meeting hall, her uniform crisp and her posture straight. As she looked out at the crowd of professionals from various fields, Michelle took a deep breath. This was a new challenge, but she had faced plenty of challenges before. She knew what it was like to have to prove herself, to face unfair judgment, and to rise above it. This time, though, it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone in that room who had faced similar struggles and needed to hear that they could make a difference. When Michelle stepped up to the podium and looked out at the audience, she felt a calm confidence. She began speaking, telling her story, not just about the flight, but about her life, her work, and the lessons she had learned. She spoke about standing up for what was right, about leading with integrity, and about being a voice for those who couldn't always speak for themselves. As she spoke, Michelle felt a deep connection with her audience. She could see the nods, the understanding, and the encouragement in their eyes. She knew that her message was getting through. At the end of her speech, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't the applause that Michelle was focused on, though. It was the faces in the crowd. She had seen the same determination she had felt in others, a resolve to be better, to do better, and to fight for what was right. In that moment, she knew that the work she was doing, both for herself and for others, was important. It wasn't just about one moment on a plane or one encounter in a courtroom. It was about every day, every action, and every word. As Michelle left the conference, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident on the plane had been just one step in a much larger journey. She had faced a challenge, stood her ground, and found strength in the process. But now she was ready to take that strength and use it to make a bigger impact. She was ready to continue breaking down barriers, inspiring others, and helping to create a future where respect wasn't earned by appearance, but by action. That night, as Michelle sat down to dinner with Maya, she smiled at her daughter. "I hope you know, sweetheart, that anything is possible. As long as you believe in yourself and stay true to your values, there's nothing you can't do." Maya looked up at her mother with admiration. "I know, Mom. You've shown me that." Michelle felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that her journey wasn't over. There would always be more battles to fight, but she was ready for whatever came next. With her family by her side and the lessons she had learned, Michelle knew that she could face anything. And with that, she smiled, knowing that the future was brighter than ever.